Hello, everyone. My name is Keri Ramirez. I am the Managing Director of Studymove. And thank you so much for the opportunity to connect again and for the time that you are taking to join this, our first key data update of 2025. I would like to start saying a happy calendar and happy Lunar New Year to everybody. I really hope that after the very challenging year that we had in 2024 in the international education sector here in Australia, you had the opportunity to breathe, to take a pause, and to re-energize for what is going to be another interesting year. And that's pretty much the topic that we're going to cover today. We thought that after all the uncertainty that it was created in 2024, and based on that uncertainty, it's normal to see that the sector is starting the year wondering what's next, what's going to happen. We thought it would be important just to really get into the year looking back and trying to understand some of the lessons that hopefully will help us just to tackle the challenges of 2025. So once again, thank you so much for your help, for the opportunity to connect with you, and really, I hope that this is a good year for everybody. And while I'm getting my slides ready, let me just start sharing now. Just a reminder that let me just go here, share. That this session is recorded. So we will share with you the recorded version and all the slides that will be presented today. The data that we are presenting today is in the public domain. So we are using data that is on the public domain and some of the data that it has been collected by Studymove from us. And as I said, the aim is really just to help the sector and help education providers and everybody that is part of this community just to navigate the challenges that we'll face this year. But also really to complement and to put a perspective. We know that 2024 brought, as I said, a lot of uncertainties. And there are a lot of views, there are a lot of opinions, there are a lot of feelings that come from the state of the sector. So the aim for us is just to put something additional that will hopefully help your institutional, efforts, just to engage more effectively with international applicants, to help you just to understand some of the big changes that we faced last year and that we are still facing as we go. I should say that for us also has been very important just to work in something that we think is going to be a crucial part of 2025. For us, 2024 was a year of uncertainty because the changes in the policy framework created by the Australian government came not at the start of the year, but through the year. And I will talk about that in a minute. So I think that this year, 2025, is going to be really the first year where universities in particular and other education providers will be able just to readjust. And one of the great things that we have seen in the past in this sector is this ability of adjust to a new environment and to reinvent itself and to keep doing what is important for the sector and to reach those institutional goals. Last year was very hard to do that. It was very hard just to change, to adapt, because it was just a change in the rules of the game. But I think this year we're gonna see that, and for that reason, we have worked in putting together a set of reports that we think it will help institutions just to find the new way in which they're gonna do this engagement with international applicants. And we are happy to see that we are progressing really well in our 2025 suite of data reports that are available for our clients, of course. And we think that this is going to be extremely useful just for you to make those decisions on how we are going to readapt to the new framework that we are all facing. Okay? But before we get into that, we're actually going to look at the data that has been available. I think that after more than 12 months of changes in the policy framework, it's very important really just to look back for a second and to see what are the main lessons of 2024 with the aim of taking those learnings and trying to figure it out what can we expect in 2025 so we can actually move forward in this year of transformation because I think that's exactly what is going to happen. It's going to be big institutional changes and looking back, I think it's going to be very useful just to see where we're heading, how you can actually time those changes and what direction actually institutions will take in terms of how they will respond to this new policy framework. And I really want to emphasize on this. I think really one of the amazing features of the international education sector in Australia, it has been this great ability and skills just to basically readapt, to look for new ways in which you can engage with international applicants. Just a good lesson or a good case study of that is what happened during COVID, that while we had the borders closed, institutions quite rapidly actually managed just to change the delivery of their programs from offline to online. It was one of the things that did not happen across the world, and in Australia we did that. So I know that we probably are a little bit uneasy about the changes that institutions will take, but I think that this sector is going to again show that ability just to basically readapt on the new policy framework. Okay? All right. So let's start looking at the lessons from 2024. And I think that 2024, as we all know, it was a year of many policy changes that unfortunately it was not only the amount of changes that we have, it was the timing of the changes. And I think this slide in many ways probably shows and illustrates what we actually experience, because we start at the end of December 2023 with the announcement of Ministerial Direction 107. And from there, it was probably every 6 weeks, every 8 weeks that we saw these new sets of policies really popping into the system and with announcements made by the Australian government. And I think that was really the difficult or the most difficult part of 2024, that it was not just one announcement with a set of policies, it was the constant change and the constant volatility that education providers had to face. And that's why I think that's going to be one of the big differences with 2025. Time will tell. But these constant announcements, I think that's what actually create this high level of uncertainty. And that high level of uncertainty, of course, was on top of it by the discussion, was actually reached the high level with the discussion on the proposed cap on international student enrollments, which it was during like May and all the way to December that took basically the focus of the sector. And when I say the sector, I said pretty much everybody in the sector. I'm talking about international applicants, education providers, policymakers, of course, and of course, prospective and current international students. And all that time and all that effort and that discussion, as we know, fade away at the very last minute of the year when the opposition party decided not to support the bill that it was in the Senate. And as a result of that, really in the last minutes of 2024, this proposed cap on international enrollments from a change in the ESOS bill actually was transformed in what is now the Ministerial Direction 111, which I will talk about that in a minute. But I think that in a way shows all the different changes that we had to face in terms of policy framework. And I think that the big question that we have at the moment, or we need to really understand, is what is the result of all these changes? I think that, as I said, through the year in 2024, we saw a lot of analysis, a lot of views, a lot of opinions, a lot of feelings. But I think it's very useful, and I invite you to do your own basically analysis or assessment of the data, so we can actually really understand what has been the impact of all these changes. Because you can see, it's not only one, it's many changes that is affecting the sector in many different ways. So what I'm going to just show to you is two sets of metrics. And we have been looking at the different metrics that could give us a better understanding of what has been the impact of the setting of new policies in 2024. And that itself is actually quite complicated because there is like an ocean of metrics that everybody's talking about. There is this conversation about net migration, arrival of students, commencements, enrollments. So I just want to take some time to look at the two metrics that we think that really help us just to understand what happened in 2024 and bring perspective. So we can actually from there look at 2025, okay? So the first one that I really want to share with you is the result on the the number of temporary student visa holders in Australia. And that metric is going to give us a lot of very interesting insights on what happened when these policies were actually established. And the second one, which is a more traditional metric, which is international student commencements, I'm actually going to take some time in talking about the commencements of 2024, because that's also a metric that is pretty much the main currency when you're talking about student recruitment. It's basically what helps us just to understand what it has been the big change and in which areas, in which markets. So I'm going to talk about the two metrics, and hopefully that's going to help us just to understand more of what was the story and the lessons of 2024. Now, starting with the number of temporary student visa holders in Australia, this is a really interesting metric. And basically, this metric basically takes a photograph on a quarterly basis on how many individuals with student visas are in Australia at in a certain period of time. So you can see back in September 2019, we had about 630,000 temporary student visa holders. Then, as we know, during the time of COVID and borders closed, basically that number, as you can see, it was cut in half, reaching the lowest point close to 300,000. And then during 2022, but mainly in 2023, we had this unexpected and very speedy recovery. And that's when in September 2023, we actually reached 664,000 temporary student visa holders. From a technical perspective, just to let you know, this includes primary and secondary, so basically students and dependents. So this is everybody. This is the whole universe of student visa holders in Australia. Now, we know that it was pretty much in October when the announcement of the change of policies started. That's when the government said that it was going to prune the tree, that we know that it was more than pruning. And after nearly 12 months, you're going to see that basically the set of policies basically reached probably what I think is it was their primary goal, which it was the stop in the growth on the temporary student visa holders. So in 2024, in September, it was only about 10,000 more student visa holders that we had compared to the previous year. So that basically is only an increase of 2%. Technically, it was flat. And in comparison to 2019, just an increase of 6%. Now, I really want to take a little bit of time looking at this chart and what's behind this chart, because this flattening of the number of temporary student visa holders, it is a massive, because if you think about it, the vast majority of temporary student visa holders, they're continuing students. They're individuals who are already enrolled in a program that they're basically going to be in a program for 1, 2, 3, sometimes even 4 years. So to really flat that, it was a massive effort from a policy point of view. And it shows the amount of basically restrictions that the government put in the cohort, not only in the continuum, because it was very hard to change that, but in the new group of students. In fact, according to the Department of Education, during 2024, we had about 240,000 new to Australia individuals. So it was a massive effort, really, just to flat the curve. And it actually shows how dramatically the policy framework and quickly it changed and stopped the growth in temporary student visa holders. Now, another thing that I think is interesting out of this chart in particular is that let's just remember that back in September 2019, Australia was not facing what it has been called a housing crisis. And it's really, really hard to believe that an increase of 6% of temporary student visa holders caused a housing crisis, as it has been actually put together in some of the narrative that we hear in the public domain. I think this is also very important because as we head into an election year, this is going to be again framing to, blaming international students. And of course, any increase in the number of basically not only student visa holders, but visa holders will put pressure in the infrastructure of the nation. But just to frame it and to blame international students, it just doesn't make sense. It's just simple numbers, and an increase in 5 years of 6% is really, really hard to believe. So I think this chart is important for that reason as well. So in summary, I think that this shows the level and the speed and the magnitude of the policies that they were put together in only 12 months, but also give us perspective in this conversation in terms of housing as well. And in terms of perspective, it's also useful to look at this increase of 2% that we had in 2023 to 2024 in comparison to other visa holders, because we have student visa holders, but we also have people who actually come to Australia to do business, or they are skilled temporary migrants. So it's interesting just to look at the difference that exists. So overall, September 2024 in comparison to September 2023, all visa holders, it was an increase of 6%. Students were 2% only. And if you see the comparison, oh, let me just go back, sorry. If you can see a comparison with other categories, it's very interesting just to see that other visa holders were basically, they didn't have any policies to stop their growth, actually have been growing quite significantly. One that is quite interesting is working holiday visas. That increased in 1 year 33%. Temporary resident skill employment is 31%. Bridging visas, 77%. I'm sure that there are some technicalities about that. But if you actually contrast that it was only an increase of 2% versus the other ones, once again, it shows the level of this policy framework and the magnitude of this policy framework. I think also shows something that we need to take the time just to really reflect on that in the sector and really trying to understand why the government decide to put the restrictions in the group of international students and why that resonate with certain parts of the public and didn't really make a lot of changes in these other groups as I'm sharing here, which they have been continue growing, and nobody really talks about that as much. So I think it's important, and I'm also leaving this because I think that it's important just to get some perspective of what happened in a result of putting all these policy frameworks in about 12 months. Also, I think it's important just to highlight that even though the increase in student visa holders overall, it was 2%, it was a big difference across the different sectors. And that was another interesting aspect of this policy framework. Look at this. Higher education actually increased 11%, the number of student visa holders, VET 12%, and ELICOS 43%. I'm also highlighting this because this is when it's really hard to make an assessment of the state of the sector, because really, if you're having dinner with somebody from ELICOS, it's going to tell you a very different story that is from higher education, for example, or VET or the school sector. So I think we need to acknowledge that, and we need to be taking the time to understand that even within the sector, everybody has been impacted quite differently. And I think that as we move forward, we need to understand that these policies are actually affecting everybody differently, and being careful just to making those big statements of the sector is, because if I tell you 2%, probably if you are in the English language sector, you'll be like, oh, that doesn't seem that bad, because yeah, in fact, it was 43%. Now, from the data perspective, also highlights that now more than ever, we really need to drill down and to identify what's the story that every education provider is happening or is experiencing, because the policy setting is actually affecting everybody in a very different way, which is one of the big lessons of 2024. First of all, the lesson number one, I will say, is that yes, the policies are actually stopping the growth of a student visa holders, but it has been uneven, or at least that's what happened in 2024. All right. So that's briefly the story from the temporary student visa holders perspective. And I will be, more than happy to answer more questions at the end of the session. And also, I invite everybody to look at this data set and, as I said, get the perspective that resonates or actually reflects your position in the sector, because as I said, this year in particular has been very difficult just to give you the overall state of the sector, because everybody's in a very different position. Now, looking at international student commencements, also the story sector by sector, it's different. And I'm just going to focus in this part of the presentation on the results for higher education. I will talk about other sectors in a second. But the majority of the people who are attending these sessions are from higher education. So I think it's important, just based on the limited time that we have, just focus on the results for higher education. Now, what I'm going to show you now is basically the annual results of international student commencements that we had here in Australia for the students commencing higher education programs. Back in 2019, and after many years of growth, we reached our pre-pandemic peak, which is about 170,000 student commencements for higher education in 1 year. From there, as we know, we had the decline from COVID. And as we actually saw with student visa holders, we also saw a very rapid growth in 2023, unexpected and quite quickly. So this was the first time, 2023, that we actually reached more than 200,000 commencements and a record number in commencements. Now, for 2024, I only have figures until September, but we have made some estimates that are going to be very close to the end. And that shows that we're going to be around the 212,000, which shows again that for higher education, the policies are actually, once again, stopping, the growth in the number of commencements. This number is 20% more than the pre-pandemic peak, so a really big gap. But in comparison to 2023, it's only 2%. And this is when it's a very interesting conversation to have across the higher education sector, because back in 2019, when we had 177,000, just that number was bringing conversations and discussions about how sustainable is this. Now, even though it has been a stop in the growth, and most likely this will continue in 2025, the stop in the growth, and we'll talk about that in a minute, I think it's important just to put perspective on the levels that the sector is actually bringing. And probably that's why, from a government perspective, it was that view that it has to be some sort of readjustment. And that's why it was introduction of the policy settings, among many other things. And I know there are many views, many comments about that, but definitely what this chart is showing us is that that stop in the growth technically happened. It's only 2% more in comparison to 2023, and most likely will continue in 2025. Now, what I think is interesting to look into this chart is just to look at the detail of how the policies were impacting commencements through the year. And this is a really big lesson for me in something that happened in 2024. What I'm showing you now is how the number of commencements evolved month by month. And this is how it just went accumulating month by month. What you're gonna see here, this is basically how commencements grew from January to March. So in March, we reached 105,000 in higher education. And then you're gonna see how this compares to 2023. Now, this is the 2023 is the blue line. And as you can see, even in March, we still had a very significant growth. It was 11% in comparison to 2023. Now, what I'm trying to illustrate here is something that we learned in 2024, that the introduction of the policies basically did not change the overall results straight away. It took time just to see how, first of all, students will react, but also because we had a pipeline of students, not that many students probably were affected straight away. Now, as we progress in the year, and I'm going to show you the results for April, May, June, July, and all the way to July and August, that's when we actually saw probably the full impact of the policies. And as you can see, in comparison to August 2023, basically the numbers were pretty much the same. We're flat. And this is a very important lesson because when we see at annual data, we are not capturing these effects. Basically, the annual data probably gives you, half of the year was good, second half of the year not that good. But if you see the average annual number, you will not be able to see this. So in 2024, it's going to be very important to really look at how the impact of the policies are actually affecting every single intake. And as you can see, the difference is significant because without the policies, we heading to 11% growth in a year, which is, I insist, quite significant. Now, let me just give you the final number for 2024 versus 2023. Basically, as a result of that, that's when we actually reached the 2%. So lesson from 2024 is there is a lagging effect on the impact of policies, basically when you see these overall numbers. Most likely, this is the result of our conversion pipeline. And if you think about it, for March or February, most of the students probably already had their visas granted. So any changes that happen, as it happened last year in December, may not necessarily be affecting the first time of the year, is most likely affecting the second half of the year. And we think that something similar is going to happen with a different twist, and we'll talk about that in a second, in 2025. But for that reason, it's very important just to look more frequently at how the data it's evolving. I also think that it's important just to understand that this set of policies, and you will expect that from any change in policy, but these ones in particular are actually changing, affecting markets differently. And this is because basically it's the position that they had in terms of the business status of each market, but at the same time that every market was affected differently, it was also affected differently when you see the results for first half of the year versus the second half of the year. And let me just show you that for the top markets for higher education. So for example, if you see the growth in international commencements from China, in the first half of the year was 36%. Other markets like Vietnam and Bangladesh and even Sri Lanka and Indonesia also had growth in the first half. So the effects of the policy changing did not really had an impact significant in the first half for these markets. Others like India and Nepal, straight away, they were actually in the decrease side of things. Now, for pretty much everyone in the second half, you're going to see the full effects because, for example, as you can see, places like China, instead of growing at 36%, it actually had a growth of 8%. Vietnam, instead of 31%, it actually was 4%. Sri Lanka, instead of growth, actually had a decrease of 8%. And then you have other markets that they were already decreasing on the first half, that in the second half they were decreasing even more due to the effects of the policy. So it's kind of like a two-dimension things, and I will recommend that as we progress in 2025, we look at this in more detail, because we're gonna see that these effects are different across the markets, but also across the periodicity, because it takes time to the full effects of the policies to kick in. And then you'll see that some markets, look at Nepal and especially Indonesia. Indonesia actually kept growing in number of commencements, and Nepal actually changed. For decrease actually was an increase. So I think it's more than ever very important just to look at the detail of these, so we can actually change the efforts to connect with the right applicants in the right markets based on how this is progressing. Now, across all countries and across all markets, once again, like the first half look actually pretty healthy with a 10% growth, but then the second half of the year, completely different the story with a 4.4% decrease in commencements. So I think that that's another very important lesson to have. One, there is a lagging effect in policy, but also the effects actually are different across markets, but also, once again, are across sectors. And this is when, once again, I think we need to be mindful that that's the case. When we talk about the state of the sector, it will be very different depending on which sector you are. And I'm just going to share with you, once again, the change in international student commencements for English language students. Once again, I'm just going to show you how first it was the growth on commencements in 2024, and look at how this compares to 2023. By February, we actually had already the same number of commencements, and from there, it has been a decrease in comparison to previous years. And that's, I think, that was the way in which the policy framework was set, but also it's the nature of ELICOS, which is more about new continuing students that actually had these effects in the sector. And I think it's very important, once again, that we are mindful about this as we actually get going in 2025. All right, so in 2024, for us, this is one of the big lessons. The policies will take time to fully kick in. That doesn't mean that they already, and day one, will affect everyone. Obviously, the first day that the policies are implemented, they will have an effect, but to kick in, it will take a certain amount of time. For higher education, due to that periodicity that we have, which we have the Feb intake, and then we have July, some institutions have October. It will take time, just as you see, and that's very important when we have a strategic view on how we can tackle these challenges. It's also very important just to look at how the changes have been affecting markets and sectors and providers differently, because I should mention that even for higher education, that's why we had a very different result across different universities. Universities who were engaging more with countries like India and Sri Lanka and Nepal, that immediately felt the effects of the changes in the policy, obviously felt it very quicker than other ones that, for example, have a more active engagement with places like China. So it's actually very different for everyone. And something that also I think is important to mention is that even though we have seen this lagging effect, even though we have seen that there is a different impact across markets and sector, something that I think has been common across all education providers is the impact on the conversion journey. And I think it's important just to highlight this, because that's one of the areas that the data unfortunately doesn't give you a lot of visibility, but it definitely has been one of the challenges that everybody has been dealing with since the first day that these policies were implemented. And this is a good way just to explain it. And I'm hoping that for people who are not really engaged in the area of international student recruitment, this helps just to illustrate the massive change that exists due to the implementation of these policies. So the new policies basically change the way in which recruitment is looking at the international applicant. For many, many years, the model was based on this first part of the conversion funnel. The focus was get as many eligible international applicants, and from there we will start working in the conversion. And then changes in this, basically what they call the top of the funnel. I think the millennials call it now tofu, but I'm gonna call it the top of the funnel. So any change in the number of international applicants will help you just to navigate and to estimate what it will be the final result. But these new policy changes change everything, because you can have 10,000 excellent eligible applicants that get all the full qualifications, a full offer for entry, but if they don't get their student visas, your commencements are not going to really be what you were aiming for. And I think this is going to be a massive, massive, massive shift in the way in which education providers execute their student recruitment strategies. Because as I said, it's not only now thinking about the number of international applicants or from where you want to engage, is really thinking about this processing and these limitations that they have been put in this lower part of the funnel, the LOFU, I think they call it LOFU, the lower part of the funnel, which is when the students, even though you get a COE, they get a confirmation enrollment, you still are wondering if they're going to get a visa or not. And I think this is very, very important, because this shift is going to move certain resources, is going to move the focus on the way in which education providers are operating. But it's also very important that from planning is actually bringing some challenges to particular universities. And I think that everybody outside of that unit of student recruitment need to be aware that this change is going to happen, and it's going to take time, and it's not going to be as it was happening before the implementation on the policies. And a good example of that is, for example, as simple as this. This is data that comes from the Department of Education, the Department of Home Affairs, which twice a year they actually put together a very comprehensive report in their different metrics about student visa processing time and student visas granted. Very comprehensive, and I highly recommend you to look at that. So the latest report that it was published in December only covers until July last year. So the latest numbers are going to be presented today on the screen. And this is the processing time. So basically how many days it will take for a student to get a visa granted. And this is on average 75% of the visas, how long it will take. The period that I chose, it was April to June 2023, and compared to April to June 2024, because that's when we really saw, is the latest one available, by the way, in this report, but also is the one that really can help us just to compare a period where we had not a new policy framework versus the new policy framework, and just see the difference. So before we had the restrictions in the growth on the student visas numbers, it usually was taking on average about 20 days to get an offshore student to get a visa for higher education, 30 for bed, 31 for a school. A year after, when the new policy framework was implemented, it's taking now, or it took now double the amount, from 18 to 41 to get a visa. That a significant growth, and even for the school sector, a very significant growth. So when you think about only that from your conversion journey and your conversion funnel, is changing everything, and the timing on the way in which you are engaging with applicant and when you will recommend for students to get their visas is significantly changing. And of course, that's going to move education providers to look more at this, because we're not talking about just a few days. We're talking about doubling, tripling, or even quadrupling the numbers of days in comparison to what we had before. And this, once again, it was also different across certain markets. Some markets, like the Philippines, look at that, from 29 days that used to take before, up to 165 days. India from 18 to 67. Vietnam from 26 to 69. So it's going to be very, very important. And can you imagine the amount of resources that everybody needs to put just to look at this? But it's going to be very important to look at this, because otherwise, universities and education providers are going to have to put a lot of resources in getting this right number of applicants, and then it's just going to fade away when we reach the lower part of the funnel. So I think this really gives us an indication of how even the processing times have been affected by the new policy it's setting, and something to look at, and I invite you to look at in more detail. So based on these lessons from 2024, and they may be others, and as I said always, this is just to complement some of your own institutional efforts and analysis. We're just trying to put perspective. In this second part, we are trying to figure it out, what can we expect in 2025, which definitely is going to be a year of change for the international education sector. This is when institutions are going to be able just to adjust their strategies. We believe it was extremely hard to do this back in 2024 because, as we explained, policies kept changing, and it was really hard for institutions just to find which one was going to be the rule book of the year. In 2024 seems to be that we will have more stability in the policy framework, but I think it's important just to take some time and to revisit how things may change and how institutions will respond to these changes. And although we believe that the core aspect of 2025 will be basically the look into the internal Australian policy framework, I think it's very important also to acknowledge that there will be other factors that could affect the results of 2025. The big one, and this is going to be quite significant, was the change in administration in the United States. If the narrative that it was followed by the Republican Party actually takes place in the policy area, which it seems that it will be like that, basically we're going to see the same effects that we saw in the first administration of Donald Trump, where if you can look at the data, it was a decline in the number of new international students. The welcoming essence of the US as a study destination changed significantly. So it's quite possible that we will see that. And it will be interesting just to see what happened, because that, which is a large group of students who were seeking opportunities in the US, that definitely gonna go and look for possibilities in other destinations. So that's something that is gonna play a significant role in 2025, beyond what we'll be experiencing in Australia in terms of policy framework. The other one who are actually linked to this change in administration in the US is the economic outlook. For Australia, unfortunately, it seems that the economy is getting weak. And we know that international students play actually a significant economic contribution. And this may change a little bit of the narrative of the government towards international students. So we need to have a closer look into that. And I think it's important just to understand that this might be the case if the economic conditions in Australia actually get weaker. And also linked to that is the narrative of a federal election. I think that that's something that we know is going to happen in the first half of the year. We know that things like cost of living and migration are going to play an important role in the narrative of the campaigns. But I think that it's important just to understand that one thing will be the actual narrative that we will have to challenge and tackle during the campaigns, and a lot of commentators and views. But the actual change of policies, we don't think that it will be anything significant in terms of change of policies. I think that the data that I show you at the start of the presentation shows that the policy setting that the government currently implement is really reaching the objective that they had, which it was to stopping the growth in the number of international students. And for that reason, we don't think that it will be any major announcements or major changes. as I said, during the campaign, it will be a lot of narrative happening, but regardless, any potential change of policies, it might not be impacted what you're actually doing until the second half of the year. So I think it's important just to have some clarity into that on what is narrative, what is the speech, rather than what is the actual policy, and then what is actually the change that the policy is actually having in your strategies. But definitely that's something that we have to consider. But still, at the end of the day, I think it's really the change in the policies and how we as sector adapt to this new policy framework, what I think is going to be a big change in 2025, actually the main focus in 2025, which, as I explained at the start of the presentation, we had these sets of policies which have been complemented by the implementation of Ministerial Direction 111, which changed what it was Ministerial Direction 107. Now Ministerial Direction 111 has a different twist. It's going to be a centerpiece in the way the policy framework will be implemented or has been implemented. And I think that's why I'm just going to take some time just to explain some of the changes and some of the impact that this Ministerial Direction 111 will have in the engagement with international applicants. So Ministerial Direction 111 replaces Ministerial Direction 107. It's different to Ministerial Direction 107 and is actually attached to the proposed caps for international student enrollments that every education provider received for 2025. They are not necessarily caps, but basically they set specific limits to providers in the way in which they can grow their student numbers. So the first one definitely is to reduce the growth of student visa holders overall, because there is kind of like an overall limit for all education providers in all sectors, whether in higher education and in the vet sector. I should mention that, and I said on the slide, that this only applies to offshore student visa applications and applies mainly to higher education providers and to vet providers. Now, the second intention, apart from reducing the growth of student visa holders, is a more even approach to visa processing across education providers. So basically looks to redistribute the growth in international student numbers across education providers. So it's a measure that not only reduces the growth, but tries to reallocate how every education provider is actually engaging or growing their international student program. And that's a big change, because in the past, we had student visa policies that they were focused more in a specific citizens of a specific markets, when now it's more focused on education providers that are provider driven. And that's a significant change in how the sector has been operating in the past. And that's what actually is going to push to education providers to basically readapt and look for ways in which they're engaging with international applicants in a very significant way, because everybody pretty much is under a different framework when it's in regard to Ministerial Direction 111. So in the way in which Ministerial Direction 111, 111, you decide how you want to talk to you, how you want to call it, works, is looking at what is a threshold of 80%. So every education provider has their allocated cap, who was set by the Department of Education. And when education providers reach 80% of the confirmation of enrollments, which is basically 80% of their acceptances, there are going to be two groups in which processing times of student visas will actually be allocated. So before education providers reach 80% of their limit, they will actually be in a priority one, which is called high visa processing. But as in the moment they reach 80% of their annual allocation, which is after 80%, is going to be a significant reduction on the processing times of student visas. So as you can see, it's not technically a cap, but obviously it creates constraints in the way in which education providers can just grow unlimited, if you want to think about that, their number of international students, basically because it's going to take a lot longer after you reach the threshold of 80% to get their visas granted, if the student obviously qualifies to get the visa granted. Now, something that I think it's important to mention is that the naming of this priority 1 and priority 2, it's a little bit unfortunate because it seems that priority 1 is more of a normal visa processing and priority 2 is more of a slow or probably a very slow visa processing. But anyhow, and I understand why policymakers have done this decision, but high and standard is actually a little bit confusing. There is nothing high and standard necessarily from this. It's more about kind of like the normal processing time versus a very slow processing time. And I think it's going to be interesting just to get a better idea of what is the meaning of these high visa processings and how is the meaning of this standard that I would personally call slow visa processing. And at the moment, the only reference that we have is once again this information that came from the Department of Education, which it really helps us just to kind of wonder how long it will take student visas. And you already saw this slide previously, but it seems that what is called high visa processing, it will be probably closer to the times that we had back in 2023, which will be about 18 days for higher education and 30 for vet. That's just our assumption, our view. I think it would be great if education providers get more clarity from the Department of Home Affairs, which I'm sure they're happy just to provide this as we go. But the second one, which is after reaching that threshold of 80%, it will be interesting just to know what is this standard visa processing, which I have the impression that it's going to be a lot more of what you see here in these blue bars. I think we're thinking about is going to probably take 90 or 100 days for higher education, but I think that it will be important for education providers to get more clarity as we go. Really, it has the Ministerial Direction has been for a month, so I think that they are just trying to figure it out how long it takes. But this, as you can see, changes completely the way in which education providers will be engaging with applicants next year. And also creates, once again, these big two groups. And I think that it's important just to understand that this policy is one that definitely is going to change the way in which education providers are engaging, and is going to be some changes that I will mention in a few minutes. But before that, I think it's important just to once again look at some of the effects in the policy that I think is important just to get some perspective. The first one is that although we know that Ministerial Direction 111 has effects the next day, the reality is that in the overall numbers, I think you're going to see more challenges and delays for your cohort that it will start in the second semester, because this Ministerial Direction was announced, I think it was 16th of December or 18th of December. So by then, it was most likely that your offshore students already had a visa for semester 1. Of course, it will be, or there has been already some challenges, and I think we already acknowledged that, but the vast majority of the students for that intake already had their visas, and those visas were actually processed based on the previous Ministerial Direction 107. But definitely from there, every single student, and especially for second semester, will be affected by this Ministerial Direction 111. Which is a little bit of a concern because it seems that some universities may have already reached the 80% thresholds, and they're already having to establish these slow visa processing times for the complete cohort of students for the second semester. So I think that there's a lot of things that have to be considered, but I think it's just important just to get some perspective on the effects of the policy. And that's when I think it's going to be very, very interesting to look at how education providers will or may adjust their strategies, because the current policy framework is creating basically two groups of education providers. Some that will be affected by these constraints more than others. And if you think about it, back in 2023, before all this started, pretty much every single education provider had similar conditions, but since 2024, but most importantly in 2025, with this introduction of these constraints per education provider, definitely we're going to have two groups of institutions. We're going to have a group of institutions that are cap constrained, or if you don't want to call it cap, growth constrained, and some others that, because the allocation that they had in 2025 allows them to grow, they're going to be able to grow basically more than others. So we're going to have these two groups, and it's going to be interesting just to see how things change and how everybody adapts differently. What we know, for example, or we expect, is that all universities, once again, are going to have this greater focus in conversion. They're going to really look how that pool of applicants, they really can take them from the top of the funnel to the lower of the funnel for basically a successful commencement. But the cap constrained universities obviously are going to have a greater focus on this, because if you don't have basically, if you don't process if you don't process applications, for example, quicker enough, maybe the timing just to successfully get a visa under the what they call it, the standard visa processing, will actually create probably an unsuccessful commencement. You also probably have because now you have a restricted number of commencements, you really need to look more at what kind of applicants you want to engage with, not only volume, but also quality. So it's really going to change everything in the way in which education providers have been operating. And probably if you want to look at from a marketing perspective, also is going to be clear as we progress that cap constrained universities, because once again, they just have a very limited number of commencements, not a very limited, a limited number of commencements. They're going to look for strategies that help them to maximize revenue. One, those universities that they have room to grow are going to look for ways in which they can increase market share. So very different strategies across both groups. And a good example of that we're starting to look is, for example, the pricing strategies. This is not every single university in each group, but we start seeing, and we are currently working in our 2025 comparative analysis of fees for Australia. We're starting to look at some of the cap constrained universities are actually increasing above the average their fees, because that's how they think they can actually maximize revenue. You cannot grow your number of students, but you can grow revenue if you actually increase your fees and you stay in a level that allows you just to basically maximize the group of students that you have been allocated, plus the maximized price that you are putting to your programs. In the other side, the growth potential universities, and once again, this is not everyone. We have seen a few doing this. They're actually going, increasing their annual average a little bit lower, thinking that this is a good opportunity to engage with markets that probably have difficulties to attract, and with a affordable value proposition, increase the number of students. So it's completely different what every education provider is doing. Another interesting example is in regards to scholarships, which we know that for many universities, it has been a complementary part of their pricing and marketing strategies. What we have noticed at this stage is that the group that is looking to grow potential universities, which in many cases were the group of universities who were affected by Ministerial Direction 107. They are looking for the use of country-specific scholarships just to re-engage with market. They really want to bring the attention and basically saying, look, here we are, which it was a strategy that it was actually used quite a bit during COVID and after the borders reopened. So we have seen that some of these universities are actually doing it. And in the other hand, and this actually we don't have evidence, this is something that we think it might happen. We might see that some universities who are cap constrained, and because their constraints that they have, they will have a lot of students probably in that standard, standard priority visa processing, which is the slow one. They will look for ways to incentivize applicants for early conversion. They look for ways in which you can basically say to students, if you do it now and you get your acceptance earlier, not only you will be able just to probably go through that slow process, but we, in a way, we're going to kind of like help you with an early conversion scholarship. So as I said, we haven't seen them yet, but we saw a few of those during COVID, and it could be that some universities may actually take this tool just to basically deal with the challenges and the new policy framework. The other thing that and this is definitely something that we have noticed, this is since especially November, definitely many education providers and universities in particular are really looking forward to changing their model. They understand that this policy framework is going to stay here for longer. It's not something that is going to fade away, and they are looking for ways in which they can diversify the funding model, and they are looking for probably be more active in the postgraduate full paying student market. They are looking to ways to engage with study abroad students, and also they are looking for offshore pathways as well. So we just want to highlight that at least for the Ministerial Direction 111, we know that the effects start on day one, and I know that education providers have been challenged from day one, but the full effects most likely will be seen on the second half of 2025. So as we suggesting, when you look at the 2024 data, we really think it's important just to look into more detail on to see how these changes are affecting you. We actually think, once again, that we're going to see a shift into how the conversion funnel is getting a greater focus or not, simply because it's not only about getting a higher number of international applicants, it's how you can ensure, and at what time, at what periodicity, how can you ensure that you can fully maximize that group of applicants that you have, because we now have constraints. So it's going to be a shift into how we actually do this conversion of students. And as I said, for that reason, once again, I think it's going to be very important just to see how the effects are affecting not only specific periods, but also specific markets. And once again, understanding that markets and sectors are actually going to be affected differently. So looking at that. And definitely one thing that is going to happen in 2025, it will be unlikely that education providers said, I'm not going to change. We're going to see a lot of changes. We're definitely going to see a way to reinvent themselves. And that's, as I said, that's one of the big skills that this sector has. And during COVID, the sector showed a great deal of resilience. So I think that what this sector might actually show is that way in which they can actually adapt in the future. So I hope that this brief presentation, well, not the brief, this was a lot to cover, really helped you. We will be having a closer look at the data as we progress. Hopefully, this will help just to have a better understanding of where we're going, and more importantly, I insist, to complement what you are actually looking in your own assessment. I think this is going to be a year where the big general outlook is not enough. We really need to look at the things that are relevant for each institution, and we'll be very happy to assist you thank you so much again for your time and your interest. And if you need more information about our products and services, please let us know. We are happy to help. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And in the meantime, once again, thank you so much for tuning in, for joining us, and we'll be in touch with you very, very soon. Thank you again. Take care. See ya.